Greetings. This presentation covers Epicor Eclipse ERP, Linux Universe Database, and Eclipse printer location and terminal ID setup. Whew, boy, that's a lot of words. Eclipse has two ways of doing printing that they've done over the years, and depending on whether or not you have an older implementation of Eclipse or a newer one, or have bought a companion product, will determine which one that you've got. For older implementations, Eclipse was built around the old Unix print queues, and so this process is going to cover those old style print queues in older systems. If you're a newer Eclipse user, more likely than not you've been put in place with the newer Eclipse Forms process, and this does not use the Unix print queues. This tends to use a separate Windows server hosting print queues, and it relays through that. The advantage of the Eclipse Forms is that if you buy the enhanced product, you can make major modifications to your own forms without having to call up Eclipse and have program modifications done. And Eclipse Forms does most of its management administration either at the Windows Server end or at in Solar in Eclipse Forms, and they've got all the management tools built in that. Anyway, this presentation covers none of that. This is just the old style Unix print queue system. Back in the day when you bought Eclipse, the installer would hand you a copy of the Eclipse Redbook, and the Redbook handled some basic things that you had to know to do administration of the system. Some how to run the backups, how to execute the scripts to do upgrades, I think, and how to set up printers. Setting up printers used to be an incredible pain in the ass. It was very tedious. You had to go in a bunch of different spots and do a bunch of things. And at some point they fixed up all that and added this lovely Add Unix Linux Printer utility, which now does most of that work for you, so you don't have to think about it. As you've probably surmised by now, all of this is done in the eTerm text mode interface. Solar does have links to get at these utilities. All it's going to do is start eTerm session for you, so that is what it is. But keep in mind, if you've got an Eclipse Forms setup implementation, then all of that's either done at the Windows Server console or through Solar, and not through the eTerm interface. Anyway, before you run the Add Unix Linux Printer utility, take a look at the existing printers that you have in the system using the Assign Printer Facts window that you've got there, and hit the F10, and that'll give you the listing of LP, the LP numbers 1 through, well, in this case you can see 30, and what names that you have in the system before you go about trying to create a new one, so that you know what available LP number is and what the naming convention is for your system. So now you have an idea of what free LP number to use. You can start the utility, enter in that unused LP number. Hopefully you've gotten your printer and it's on the network, and you've assigned it a static IP address. You don't want dynamic ones. And you'll go ahead and put in your IP address there, and Alt-C to create printer. Right off the bat, the utility is going to ask you whether or not this is a label printer, and Eclipse does support certain models of Zebra label printer, and the recommended one is the ZT230. This is not what we're going to be setting up in the example here, because that's a fairly uncommon setup. Next we come to the Assign Printer Facts section, and here you're going to go ahead and put in the naming convention for your printer, and every company is going to have a different naming convention. In the case of my company, we have it set up for 2 letters representing the branch, a dash, and 3 letters for some type of name of it, or sometimes it gets a little longer than that. Anyway, in this example, my naming convention is Chatsworth Branch Multifunction Printer number 2. Since this part of Eclipse was coded back in 1991, the listing of printers that you have is pretty much what you would have seen in 1991. and of course they wrote the whole thing pretty much assuming that you'd have a Hewlett-Packard LaserJet printer. So the selection of printers you have are HP 2000s, 4000s, 8000s for the most part. The common printer that you use, regardless of what printer you actually have, is the HP 4100 TN 2-tray printer. And if realizing, of course, that those printers are about 30 years old at this point, if you're not using that type of printer, that's okay. The Eclipse is going to work okay pretty much with any printer that supports the HP PCL5 language, which is just about any laser printer these days. And you can do 1 or 2 tray. 2-tray printers are, of course, preferred for Eclipse for a variety of reasons. Keep in mind, if you use non-Hewlett-Packard printers, you may get some erratic behavior. So I really try and stick with HP LaserJets if you can. They're good battle-hardened. They're about the only thing I've ever come across that can handle the dusty environment of a warehouse and still keep working. If you've got old HP 4100 TNs, hold on to those things for dear life. Those suckers will outlive you. Any model of Hewlett-Packard printer that they've produced since that point is not 1/4 as good as the 4100. I've always said the 4100 is so tough you could probably run a dead cat through it and it would still work. I have not tried that, but that's the theory. If you've got newer HP printers, or if you're trying to figure out what printers to get, any newer HP 4200 series, P3000 series, or the newer M600 series will work as well with this printer driver. The biggest issue is just select whether you've got 1 tray or 2 tray, and as I said, the recommended is 2 trays. Back in the day, I believe that Eclipse was assuming that you would have pre-printed forms set up and set in certain trays in your printers. I don't think people really do that anymore because of the expense of pre-printing forms. So you've probably had Eclipse code your forms for you and put them in place, and you're just putting in blank paper, although it's probably colored. As is suggested, there's multiple different colors that you use to represent different processes in your company. This is an old way of thinking, but it works, and it still works just fine. Most printers that you set up are probably just going to have the forms of invoice for the sales order entry and pick ticket print to come out, and plain, which is just plain paper for reports or reprints that are usually done. Over here, the other window will show you some of the other examples of forms that you may have set or may want to set up to load up. But as I said, invoice and plain most commonly. So after you've set the forms, you hit escape a couple of times. It's going to ask you if you want to assign the printer to a location. Of course you want to do that, so tell it yes. You may have noticed in the previous screen it does have an alt location assignment that looks like you could have done it there, but it will not let you do it in that part, in that step. You have to let the script go through and do its thing, and then let it ask you if you want to add the location. Yes, that's a nuisance, but there you are. So in our next bit here, we assign the existing printer location that we want this printer to be a part of, and the terminal IDs and printer locations are covered a little bit later in this presentation, so don't be too worried that you may not know what that is yet. So here we're assigning our new printer to an existing location, and printer locations are just a logical grouping of the printers that you're going to assign a group of people to. Now keep in mind that if you assign another printer to a location and you've got multiple printers in that location that have the same loaded forms, when a user goes to log in and they're using that location, the Eclipse may prompt them again to select which default printer to use because it sees that it's got a couple of potential printers that might be printing the same thing. So after you assign the location and escape a couple of times, if you did everything right, the script will tell you that the printer was added successfully and everything's lovely. Now what's going to be covered next is what exactly this script did on the back end, and that's just in case something got dicked up and you got to figure out where things went wrong. What's covered in these next few slides are also covered in the Eclipse Red Book. If you log into the Epicor Eclipse site, you can download a copy of the Red Book from them there and review this. And good luck trying to make sense of it. It's pretty raw, but anyway, there it is. So the first thing that that is done in the process of creating the printer is they create what they call a driver file, a DVR file, and honestly, I'm not really sure what the heck this thing does. They don't explain it, but the Universe database was at one time its own operating system. So essentially what it looks like they're doing is you have to create the device in the Universe operating system / database. Then they use this dummy file, if you will, of binding the virtual device driver in Universe to the real Unix print queue that you're going to create. And then after that, you of course create the Unix print queue. And then you modify the host file for the IP address, so you're using the LP naming convention to resolve to an IP address. Anyway, I think that's for the most part what's going on here. So first thing to check if something goes wrong is to go to your Red Hat Linux server and take a look in this user spool UV folder in your hard drive system, and make sure that you've got an LP numbered driver file there with the right permissions. And if not, create one. The command that you can see here, it's in the red books, but essentially it's just a one-line text file with execute permissions set on it. So where you see the little green arrow, that's the command you'd have to put in if you'd have to create it manually. So after you check the DVR file and make sure that it was created and the permissions have set correctly, then you'd actually go into Universe and make sure that the virtual device was created in it as well. Here are the steps that you would use to get into it. This can only be done in command mode at the console for the most part. And you go to the U2 directory, you run UV, it'll start the Universe interface. You of course select maintain devices, and then you can look up by the LP name and see if the device was created, and if not, you go ahead and create it. And yeah, I realize none of this makes any sense, but essentially if it's not created, if you just type in what you see here with the appropriate LP number, it'll all work out. And if you goof something up, you can always delete it and recreate it again. Next thing to check will be the IP address in the host file. Hosts is found under the etc folder in the Unix Linux file system, and the host is just the listing of IP addresses for the device and the name that's used to reference the IP address. And so quite often what's likely to have happened is you've either picked the wrong IP address, or there's a communications failure between where the device is sitting logically on your network and where your Red Hat Linux host is sitting. So once you've checked the host file to make sure that the entry is in there and that you've entered in the right IP address, and if not, well, then just run the VI editor and edit the host file with the right IP address information and escape and save out of it. Once you've done that, then you can do a standard ping test, which will test the connectivity between the Linux host and the printer device, and that'll tell you whether or not you've got to work on routing tables on your routers, or change some setting on your network, or plug the damn printer into the network and turn it on. After you've checked the host file and you've done the ping utility and you're sure that's correct, then you'll want to go in and make sure that the CUPS print queue was created. And you can do this through the command line, but I find it just easier just to go to the damn console and do the graphical thing. So you can find the CUPS printer utility under administration, under printing, and and see if your LP number print queue is there correctly. As we can see in our example, ours is. The settings in cups is pretty straightforward, not a whole lot of complexity to it. Do keep in mind where you see that state, make sure that you've got the check mark enabled, or else that would explain why your new printer isn't working. As you can see here in the policy, by default it's usually set to if there's a major error, network connectivity, or the printer jams up and has an error or something, it stops the print queue. That's to keep it from accidentally losing jobs from the print spooler. And it gives you time to go fix whatever went wrong with the printer, reset it all, clean it up. But keep in mind, once you've got all that done, you're going to have to go back in here, click enable, refresh, and all that good stuff in order to restart the print queue so all those backed up jobs will print through. If you don't do that, then you will see no difference. You may want to change the error policy to auto restart. That's entirely up to you. But anyway, these are the defaults. That's what you do. So that covers the printer creation. Now we're going to explain printer location creation and terminal IDs. So printer locations are groupings of where the printers are physically located in reference to your users that are going to use them, so you can assign one to the other. Ideally, unless you're a sadomasochist, you would set the printers that user is going to use near where the user is physically located, unless you feel that they need some exercise. The naming convention, at least what we're using here in my company, is the branch number, a period, and then the functional area in 7 letters. So AP would be accounts payable, AR would be accounts receivable, counter, the executive management, inside, office, you get the idea. Once you've created your printer location and you've assigned the printers that you want in that location, you may want to go ahead and assign which forms come out of what trays if you've got pre-printed forms or there's an issue to deal with. There doesn't seem to be a straightforward mechanism to do this. What you have to do is, on your new printer, you have to change your assigned printers so that printer shows up. Then you have to go to Forms Loaded, and then you can set which forms are in which tray, as best as I can tell. Terminal IDs and printer locations go hand in hand with each other. You have to have both. The printer location just logically group the printers together. The terminal IDs will use the printer location, but then adds another layer of functional information for Eclipse. So the terminal IDs are used to assign printers to a user when they log into a particular PC and terminal. They also control the terminal behavior, log on, log off behavior, the what branch you're pricing from, what your supplying warehouse is, what sales source is utilized when the sale's done, so what that number is posted to, and the default ship via. The format for the terminal ID, for some strange reason I've never understood, is lowercase letters. It's 6 characters max, B for branch, and then the number, and a period, and 3 letters for the location. So usually you want the abbreviation for the terminal ID to be similar to the printer location. That's not always the case, but that's what you're kind of trying for. Once the terminal ID is created, your Solar interface or your eTerm interface, or both, depending on which ones you're using, have to have that ID set in so that when you start the session it knows which one to use. The reason why the terminal ID is set at the software, at the physical terminal itself, and say not at the user, is imagine if you have a user, a salesman, that floats around between branches. If what branch and what warehouse and all of that good stuff, if that was set at the user account level, then as soon as they stepped in a different branch, the system wouldn't know how to properly do the order. It would assume that it was pulling it from the other warehouse, the other branch, and all that good stuff. So that's why the terminal ID is set in the software where the physical PC is actually at. Now, having said what I said, you could possibly, if you wanted to, if you had a user that was working from home, or you had a terminal server, a Citrix server you were setting up, or for some strange reason you have a user that physically goes to one branch but you want them to logically operate in a different branch, all you have to do is change the terminal ID of the PC or where the software is loaded, so when they log in it'll set them in the right branch. And of course, when the user logs in, you'll see here both in the Solar interface and the eTerm interface, the system will show you what terminal ID you're using, and so what branch you're assigned. As an additional security measure, Eclipse will not allow a user to log into a terminal that they do not have that location assigned to them. So if you do have one of those floating salesmen and they get to the other branch and they complain to you, I can't log into the terminal, odds are you didn't set them up authorization for that particular location. If you'll take a look at the user account in Eclipse and take a look at their assigned locations and assign them that, and then once they log out and log back in again, they'll have that work out well. One of the examples of why you would restrict locations is, say, in the case of the accounts payable department. In most cases, the accounts payable department has one printer assigned just for check printing. They just have the check stock loaded in that printer. Nothing else, no other forms are set for that printer, so you don't accidentally print invoices and statements and stuff on your expensive check stock and foul things up. And you absolutely do not want any employee that you might have accidentally given the wrong authorizations to have access to that check printer and print themselves off a few prints of checks. That would be that would be a bad way to do business. So by only giving your AP users authorizations to use that location that's got the check printer in it, that's an extra level of control to make sure things don't go wrong. And this completes our presentation on printer setup, printer locations, and terminal IDs. Hopefully this information will become useful to you, and thank you for your attention. And as always, I am not Scott Zahn.